All right, you made it almost to the very end. We're going to do our projects here as soon as this last little lecture is over. We're going to talk about leading the meeting today. This would be our practical element to our supplementing our theological component, which you already heard David speak about typology in the Old Testament. One verse will be our key text. This comes from Acts chapter 15, verse 6. Acts chapter 15, verse 6 says this: "The apostles and the elders were gathered together to consider this matter. And after there had been much debate, Peter stood up." And we'll pause right there. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up. Do you like meetings? Do you like meetings, Bill? Kind of?
Depends.
Yeah.
It could be an email now.
You prefer an email or a meeting?
Well, they say this meeting could have been an email.
Yeah.
Half the time it can be.
Uh-huh. What about you, Walt? Do you like meetings?
Depends. Depends how the meeting starts,
Yeah.
Because that's usually the first few minutes of the meeting dictate how the meeting's going to go.
Right. Yeah, that's very often true. How about you, Nikki? Are you a meeting person?
I'm okay if they stay on track.
Yeah.
When I worked in the secular workforce, to me it was frustrating when you were in meetings and time was passing and passing.
Right.
You got to the place you were thinking of everything else that you had to do
Yes.
for your job.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I think we're on the same page. I don't know that. I'm sure there's somebody out there that loves meetings for the sake of me. There must be, because there's so many meetings that happen. There must be somebody out there that just loves to call them and go to them and enjoy them and participate in them.
Especially since COVID with my company.
Yeah.
Since COVID, because people weren't getting out.
The Zoom meeting.
All these team meetings, Zoom meetings, whatever, it's just like, it's over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes one of the ways in which you show that you're productive is that you're in a meeting.
That you're there. Yeah.
It's kind of weird, but
Yeah. Hey, I still work here. I'm in the meeting.
you can't
Camera on.
look how busy my calendar is. You can't.
Right.
You can't. It's like,
So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a brief philosophy of meetings and how to make them more productive. So if you are into productivity, this will be the lecture that you will probably especially enjoy. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time getting excited about meetings, for one thing, especially if they're in the evening. I have never thought to myself, even once, gosh, I can't wait to hustle through this meal so that I can hurry up and miss my family time and go out to a church meeting tonight. I've never had that thought, that I would rather be in a meeting than being at my family's side, doing anything together, versus being in a meeting. But they're necessary. It's funny, if you think about even our name, Presbyterian, this is just a joke, but Presbyterian does loosely mean another meeting, because the word literally means elders in the plural. And so if you think about all the names of the various denominations, they've all chosen their branding for some particular reason. The Methodists, they have a method. They're ready to go win the world for Christ. And the Lutherans, they look back to Luther as their champion. And the Baptists, that's kind of exciting. Baptism's an exciting thing, so they call themselves the Baptists. The best name we could come up for ourselves over all these years was Presbyterians. We're the guys that have meetings. And it's true, we have meetings all the time. We have committees, we have committee on committees, there's committee on commissioners. We have all these kinds of names that they're just, they could be a little cumbersome at times. So let me ask you this: given that fact, why do we do this? Why do we even have the kinds of meetings that we have? Why should we have them as often as we have them? Well, there's probably a couple reasons for this. First of all, they do tend to unite our focus together. They do tend to build team cooperation, and they do tend to coordinate our actions together. So we don't meet just to meet. There's got to be a better reason for getting together to do things. And that better reason, I would hope, is that we could, first of all, unite our focus, that we're on the same page. That's one of the reasons why we do have meetings, is just to make sure that our trajectory is headed in the same direction. If you have a thought about how to win the world, and I have a thought about how to win the world, they both may be good thoughts. Maybe Ray wants to set up evangelistic outposts at every truck stop, and maybe I want to win the world by knocking on every door and delivering tracts. Those ideas, maybe they're both great, But if the church is going to rally around any of those ideas, then we should at least be on the same page as far as what the purpose is. There is something intrinsic about getting together, though, even in our presence with one another, and that is that it does tend to build fellowship. And I think that in the age of Zoom meetings and online WebEx meetings or whatever other service you use, there is truly something lost that we do have whenever we get together in the same facility to look at each other face to face and to have that kind of interpersonal communication. But if we're going to try to do anything together, whether it's build a Christian education program or whether we're going to try to put a budget together, there's a sense in which we have to coordinate our actions. This is going to be a short lecture, don't worry, I promise, because it already feels like a meeting, but I promise I'm going to go through this very quickly. There is some practical stuff here that I think is going to help, though. So what do you do? How do you make a meeting more productive? Well, let's think before the meeting even starts. And help me out here. Let's just talk this out together. If you're in charge of the meeting, you're the one who's going to coordinate this, what are a couple things that you should be thinking about even a week before the meeting takes place? Hint, some of them are on the screen behind me, but feel free to add to the list. What do you want to do? Walt, you lead meetings. What do you do a week before the meeting starts? Okay. Right. And you should feel guilty. You really should feel guilty. I'm putting guilt on you right now. Guilt and shame if you hold a meeting and you're not conscious of other people's time. Because they're making sacrifices just as you are. So it is important to make sure that there's a real clear purpose to why we're meeting together. Bill, your hand.
I was going to say purpose, but also you need to make sure the right people are there.
The right people are there, yeah.
Don't invite people that don't need to be there.
Exactly. Because those people would be irrelevant to the topic, and possibly you're in danger of wasting that person's time.
And oftentimes I found that when you have a meeting that has a whole lot of people in it, it descends into chaos, or it can't, it's more likely to descend into chaos than one that has the few critical stakeholders.
Exactly. I like to have our agenda as a shared document. Some people will kind of withhold the written agenda until the very moment you sit down at the table and pass it out. I think that used to work back in the days before the cloud drive, but if you're going to be in charge of a meeting, it's good to have a buildable agenda. So one of the things that we do as a session, our elders don't always take advantage of this, but I have the agenda always live as a shared document. And whether or not I grant them editor status, which means they can actually change it, or whether I give them commenting status, I guess that depends on the context, but you can have people then comment on the agenda as it's being built. So the one reason I like to do that is that it takes away any excuse that we didn't know what we were talking about tonight, which sometimes when you have regular meetings, like the elders meet every single month and the deacons do too, if they're hit with an idea that's kind of fresh on them, it's like, whoa, well, I didn't have time to think about that. I didn't even know we were talking about that. Yeah, but if the agenda is live at all times on the shared drive, then you should theoretically always know what we're going to talk about. And not only that, but you could add to it, or at least make comments about things that you think should be added to the agenda, so that as the moderator, you can then decide whether or not that's going to get a place, and if so, where at in the agenda. I like to send out a reminder email before every meeting. I realize that's, I don't want to fill in everybody's inbox either. I don't like it when people do that to me, but it is helpful to send out a reminder email just a few days before the meeting. For one, it reminds everybody that there is a meeting coming up. And second of all, it's an opportunity for you in short form to highlight some of the most important things that you're going to be talking about in that meeting. Of course, you're going to want to do what Bill said, which is to invite the right people, and if there's any instructions for them to be prepared ahead of time, you should definitely give that. If there's a major document that you're expecting people to look over before the meeting comes, make sure to include that in the instructions before the meeting begins. Document distribution should happen as part of that pre-meeting information, because there's nothing worse than coming to a meeting and somebody hands out a 30-page document and says, hey, look this over, because we're choosing between contractor A to rebuild our steeple and contractor B, and they have totally different proposals. Let's think about this right now, and we're going to make a decision tonight. It's like, no way. No, we need to have time ahead of time to look through those documents. And with shared drives and email attachments and things like that, there should be no reasonable excuse why a person is being hit with brand new information before they've even realized what's happening. So before the meeting even starts, make sure it's going to be as efficient as possible by distributing as much information. And as Bill said, keeping that pool of relevant parties as narrow as can be, okay? So before the meeting starts, those are the kinds of things you want to work on. When you come to the meeting itself, it is helpful to have a written agenda. I have been in a few meetings before that don't have a written agenda. It's always a disaster. It's always a disaster because there's no assumed shared vision for what we're here to talk about. You may think you know what we're talking about, but if there's no written agenda, then that can honestly go anywhere. The agenda is important too, because an agenda is essentially, it's a statement of priorities, because you have 1,000 things that you could be talking about, but these are the 9 things that we absolutely must talk about. And not only that, but when you write out your agenda ahead of time, you are also, by necessity and by definition, you are selecting priorities and time-focused material. So I will often ask this question at the very beginning of a meeting, before we approve the agenda, and by the way, that is part of a well-held meeting, is that the participants will approve the agenda by way of a voice vote or something like that. I always ask them, hey, is there anything you want to move around in the order here? Because if you bury a deep topic, a very important topic, till 10:30 at night, then you're not going to have the best brain power to work on that particular item. So I will always ask people, if you want to move anything around in the agenda, let's go ahead and do that now before the meeting begins. And in that way, we can ensure that our agenda is actually realistic for what we think we're going to try to accomplish during that time. Of course, you want to include any attachments. Again, I like to do that both in paper form and in email distribution form. Some people like to work on paper. Some people like to just have it on their computer. They want to be able to save it as a PDF. It's best to give people both. You're still going to run into people that are the old school folks that want the paper documents at all times. They can write on it in pen. Other people are just going to want to have that saved, and they're going to look at it a little bit later. Now, here's what I wanted to focus in on a little bit more. I think this is where we could have a discussion, because in any meeting of any different size, let's say you have 8 people or 10 or 12 or even 20 people in a meeting, these are the 4 personality types that you're going to find that you commonly encounter. And each one of them is going to present to you a bit of a difficulty. And as the leader of the meeting, you're going to need to know how to negotiate through these 4 types of personalities. So I call these guys and man. I don't mean to be gender stereotypical here. I just needed some kind of a pronoun there. So first person that you're going to run into is tangent guy. Who is tangent guy? Does anyone know? What is tangent? Yes. Tangent guy.
Not directly related to the meeting.
Absolutely. Tangent guy is the guy that put one little light bulb in his mind, and he's running off on a long story that this reminded him of something that happened back in 1952 or whatever. Usually the story is boring. Usually the story has nothing to do with the meeting at hand. But nevertheless, tangent guy is a threat. And why is he a threat? He's a threat because he can derail the very thing that you came to do that night. So how do you deal with tangent guy? Give me some practical ideas here. Someone runs off on a tangent. You see it coming. What do you do, Bill?
Up front, as the moderator of the meeting, you would say, like, I'm going to keep us on track.
Right.
Agenda.
Yes.
If I interrupt you or cut you off, it's not because I'm trying to be rude. It's that I'm trying to keep us on track for the agenda.
That's right. So you would say that even before tangent guy has an opportunity to do his thing.
Right.
Yeah.
At the beginning.
That's prefactory material. That's right. So as the meeting is beginning, as you're calling the meeting to order, let's say, or before or just after you've prayed to start the meeting, you can say, hey, listen, we have a lot of things to do tonight. We have 2 hours to do it. I'm going to do my job diligently to keep us on track tonight. If I cut you off, please don't think I'm being rude. It's only that I'm trying to keep us centered on the material that we've come here to dispose of. That's great. So I like that ahead of time, because what you're doing is you are implicitly setting the rules of the game, so that when somebody violates said rules, then you can call them back and say, hey, don't forget, remember, we have to stay on track tonight. So that's great. Then if they do take you off track, even after you've said your prefactory material, then you can simply remind them that we've all agreed to the rule set for this particular meeting, and so it'd be best if we were all just to go ahead and stay on track tonight. Big opinion guy. Okay, who is big opinion guy? He's the guy who already knows. He's the smartest guy in the room. This is the guy who throws his weight around to always get his way. Big opinion guy can be very difficult to deal with as well. Sometimes he doesn't speak as long-winded as tangent guy does, but nevertheless, Sometimes this person comes into the meeting and he's not even really there to discuss. He's not there to listen. He's not there to share. He doesn't care much for what the others may say. He already knows what to do. So what do you do when big opinion guy shows up? Thoughts on that? How do you ameliorate his influence? What do you think, David?
If someone is maybe speaking multiple times,
Mm-hmm.
you could say, is there anyone else who has thoughts on this
Right.
before you give further opportunities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Is there anyone else who'd like to share on this? Sometimes you can even compliment their conviction, say, thank you so much for sharing that. I can tell you have strong conviction on that matter. Just for the sake of discussion, would anybody feel willing to offer a contrary opinion? Something like that could be a good tactful way to draw out conversation. The silent type, this is a person you need to be aware of because they often have more value to the meeting than you may initially suspect because certain people tend not to speak up right away. They're very often shoved over. They're very often stepped over. They're very often aggressively pushed out of the way so big opinion guy can take over. But the silent type, you will find this if you draw them out, if you ask them what their opinion is, that they very often are far more deeper in their reflections on any given matter than superficially you may give them credit for. And so one of the things that you really have to do when you have the silent type is intentionally ask them their opinion, because very often it'll be really good. Sometimes you may be wrong. You may ask them their opinion and they'll say, well, I really don't have much to say on that, and that's fine too. But there are certain personalities that don't just tend to foist themselves on the conversation right away, and when you have that kind of a person, you do as a leader have to draw that person's opinion out. It's very valuable usually. Now, do anything, man. He's valuable too, because he's your wingman. He's your guy that's willing to run through a brick wall for you. There are certain people in every single meeting that I've ever been to that you give them a task and they'll do it. Usually they'll do it very faithfully too. They're the first person to volunteer, and they probably even will be the last person to leave the meeting because they're going to be there to stay and clean up and throw away the trash and the garbage and lock the doors after you walk out. Do anything, man, is a very, very valuable asset to any team. However, there is one danger with him, and that is that some people don't have the guardrails on their own lives to be able to say no to certain requests. And it may not be do anything, man, that you're concerned about. It could actually be his wife and his children who may be being neglected because he's willing to show up and do absolutely anything you want. Sometimes do anything, man, is so helpful that he will bury himself in responsibilities and he will be crushed by the weight of all of his duties and burdens upon his life, but he just can't say no. And so pastorally, to love do anything, man, sometimes you have to be willing to not let him take on that particular assignment for his own good. Now, of course, any committee functions well when you have a couple of these types of people, but you do have to be pastorally sensitive to the fact that some people will just say yes to anything out of sheer compulsion, perhaps even the false motivation of guilt or shame, which you don't want somebody working out of that kind of an a priori, because they're going to be doing it then for the wrong reasons. Now, here are the pro moves and tactics that you need to, these are the 4 things that every meeting needs to have done by the moderator of the meeting or the person that's in charge, okay? You do have to learn the tactic of tactfully shutting people down. Now, that sounds rude and it sounds very off-putting, but there is a very tactful way. It's a leadership mechanism that we must learn to be able to adequately shut down people who are too vocal and too assertive, okay? Because while we do need vocalization and we definitely need assertion at times, you have to be careful that 2 of those previous personality types we just talked about don't end up ruining your meeting by taking the steering wheel and just driving it away from everybody else. So there are a couple of things that you can do, some of them we've already mentioned, to adequately shut people down without being rude. Can you all think of any other ways that you could regain control of a meeting before it loses control? Ray?
I would just ask the person, can you bring this to a head, bring this to a point?
Yeah. Can you summarize your main point for us? Yeah. That's good. What else?
You can always say, let's put this in a parking lot and discuss this
Mm-hmm.
outside the meeting.
Mm-hmm. Let's take it to the parking lot. That sounds like fighting words, Bill.
Well, let me
Last time I said, hey, I'll meet you in the parking lot, I ended up with that.
business speak. Parking lot is you have a whiteboard and you put it on a parking lot.
Oh, okay. I got you. Okay.
Parking lot meaning you deal with the
I
outside.
got you. I'm just messing with you. Yeah. Scott.
Something I find useful with working with students is if they're in a point where, they are off topic, they're not focused, you just tell them, take 5, let's come back, let's refocus.
Okay. Yeah. Since we're Christians, and I assume that many of the meetings that we go to are going to be Christian meetings, though not all. Could be a school board meeting, it could be a meeting for your work team or whatever. But in Christian meetings, one good way to shut down hostility is to just stop and pray. To stop and say, hey guys, it sounds like we're getting pretty intense here. Why don't we just go ahead and take a few minutes to pray about this? I think that's a good way to do it too. Sometimes it's reminding people of the rule set. Sometimes, though, it is necessary to speak directly to that person and say, Dwight, you've had a lot to say about this. I think it's time for us to listen to some other persons in the room. And that while that may come across as a little bit abrasive, if not harsh, that is sometimes what's necessary for the sake of the good. Remember, it's not just this guy that I'm dealing with, but this is a communal function that was taking place right here, and I have to be aware of everybody else's value to the meeting in the room at that time. Sorry, Dwight. Not picking on you. Walt?
This may take us in a direction you don't want to go.
Tangent guy. I see it coming right here.
One of the things that we typically don't do, but actually may be a helpful practice from other places, is actually to allow the participants to evaluate the meeting afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Written evaluation can be anonymous. The reason for that is that then the group owns its process.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than making all the weight of responsibility for the meeting fall on the moderator,
Mm-hmm.
who would have to be, the lion tamer and, those sort of things, there's this sort of a group norm that's set up. And so someone realizes, okay, if I get too vocal here, I cut other people off. My team members around here are going to comment on this after the meeting.
Yeah.
And so, again, you don't want to squelch individuality,
Mm-hmm.
but there is something about reinforcing what are helpful group norms.
Yeah, that's right. Just as it's important to learn to shut people down with grace, Holy Spirit shutdowns, right? Holy Spirit shutdowns. So also that tactic of drawing out the opinions of others that are valuable is just as necessary. There's a rule of symmetry to any conversation that your people skills will go through the roof if you can just learn this rule of symmetry. So if you're in a conversation with 2 people, you should be doing approximately 50% of the talking and 50% of the listening in that situation, given everything else being equal. Now, there are times where one person is doing most of the talking and the other is doing most of the listening. But in the average conversation, if there's 2 people there, you should be doing about half of the conversation. If you're in a room and there's 4 people, you might want to intentionally ask yourself, am I contributing about 25% of the content to this? If not, you're probably becoming that dominator and or the wallflower that's not contributing anything. And the same thing is true even in a session meeting of, let's say, 12 people in the room. Now, obviously, the moderator is going to be having more words by way of proportion just by the fact of his duty keeping the meeting going on. But if you ask yourself at any given time, am I contributing at approximately an equal value to the proportion of the people in the room? That's probably a pretty good balance. If you're the guy who has to talk about every single item, you may be unaware of what you're doing as you're actually trying to end up dominating that meeting. And if you never say anything, that's a problem too, because why are you there? You're there because you have something valuable to say. So 2 more pro moves kind of come together, summing up and moving ahead. I wish I was better at this, something I'm trying to work on a little bit myself, but if you have a particular topic that is divisive, and let's say there's a lot of friction in the room, one of the things that you have to simply do is say, okay, let me try to sum up where I think we are. sounds like most of us are in favor of going ahead with the new parking lot, although we have one or two holdouts. So you say something like that by way of attempt to sum up, because at some point you do have to move on with certain conversations. We've all been in the room where a conversation has gone on so long and it's obvious that the group is ready to take the next step, right? Well, who's going to do that? Well, it's the moderator, the person who's in charge of the meeting, has to be willing to then step out and assume we can go ahead and move on safely with this. These are the 4 moves that you really need to learn if you're going to lead a meeting effectively. Talk a little bit about minutes here. Now, again, it's like, oh man, do we have to have agendas and minutes for everything? Well, yeah, we kind of do, because the minutes actually have an important role in any given meeting. And the purpose of the minutes is to adequately and accurately record what took place in that meeting, because, one, sometimes group memory is not all that great, right? And second of all, sometimes we think we hear different things. Like David and I will often talk after a meeting and we'll be like, did you hear him say that? Is that what I thought I heard him say that, but I wasn't sure. Did you take it the same way? And then it's like, yeah, I did. So the purpose of meetings is because we corporately forget what we've done sometimes. And then also we have to make sure what has taken place is actually accurate. So the person who's recording the minutes probably wouldn't be the moderator. It might be a different person, a clerk, let's say. But to get that done as accurately as possible. And not only that, but when we record minutes, we should try as much as possible to record who was delegated each task, because that's going to hold them accountable, hold their feet to the fire. If the minutes merely said the Christian Education Committee decided to hold a conference, well, great. Next month we're going to look back at that and we're all going to stare at each other like, oh yeah, well what did we do? Well, nothing, because I thought everyone else was going to do it. So part of the minutes should be recording the delegation of tasks. And this, of course, is useful for updating the absent. Whenever you have a meeting, there's going to be somebody who isn't there. The purpose of the minutes then is to record accurately so that those who were not there can still contribute to the conversation in a just manner. Finally, this, and we'll conclude here, after the meeting, just because the meeting is over doesn't mean your role as the meeting leader is over, because there are some things that you should do before you can truly consider this in your past. You got to distribute the minutes to whoever needs to hear it. You've got to begin executing the tasks that you agree to do. You've got to communicate the results. Now let's pause right here and just focus on this, because this is where churches can be bad. I'm not blaming Gospel Fellowship. I'm just saying this happens. So you have a meeting and you do everything right, including down to recording the minutes. If you don't then share those minutes with the people that need to know, you might inadvertently create miscommunication within the church, because you're not sharing that result block with the people that need to hear it, okay? So you've done a great job at the sports recreation committee for the church. Good. You planned the whole wrestling tournament in the gym. But if you don't communicate that result to the other committees that also might want to use the gym on the same day, then you've actually done worse than if you had done nothing at all. So this is one of the most important things I think good leaders often forget, because once the meeting's over, you're like, whew, thank goodness, now we can get on to the next one, I can go on with my next role. Hold on a second. Make sure you communicate everything that needs to be communicated to from the minutes to everybody that is relevant. Now, one more pro move, and I think this is just a good, wise tactic in general. Whenever you do have a meeting that comes off as a success, it's always good to pick at least 1 or 2 people that really help that meeting go well and say something to them by way of thanks. Usually just a text message is enough, or a phone call the next day. If they did something really excellent, maybe send them a card. But when a leader sends you a note of thanks, even if it's just something small, it really does help to affirm the person, because the last thing you want for people to think is that the meetings are irrelevant and boring. Okay, that people need to be valued, and as much as you can do that, that is a very, very helpful thing. All right, so I know it's a bit of a boring lecture here, but look, I mean, part of church life is very mundane, right? It's very everyday, and yet if we do the everyday things well, then what we find is that many of the big things go well also. Anyone have any last thoughts about the idea of meetings or how to do any pro tips? David, do you have some pro tips?
Just a question.
Sure.
So at Presbyterian meetings, the moderator has much more of a passive kind of facilitating sort of role. In committee meetings in churches, oftentimes
Yeah.
kind of role. How do you balance as someone's leading a meeting, balance on one hand the role of facilitating the work of others,
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, helping to guide that work and contribute
Yeah.
as part of the team? How do you balance those two things?
I don't know if I do it well. And it really does depend on the situation, because in some meetings, the expectation is the moderator doesn't give his opinion or throw around his weight very much. The more formal the meeting, often the more formality is required of the moderator position. So at General Assembly, for instance, if the moderator is actively opining on every controversial topic, that's probably going to be an unhealthy meeting, because his role there is almost like a judge. He's evaluating certain things, he's weighing the moment, and he does give his opinion, but it's usually on procedural things rather than on every given controversy. In smaller meetings, like a session meeting or a Christian education meeting or a youth committee meeting or something like that, it may be more necessary to weigh in your own personal inclinations. But generally, still, though, the leader's main focus is to make sure the meeting is a healthy setting. What do you think, David? Do you have any opinion on that? Okay. Yeah, Dwight?
That brings a bell. I'm wondering if whoever brings that or leads the meeting, are they typically the ones that actually come up with all the ideas or many of the ideas? Or is it up to the leader ahead of time to go, maybe from a previous meeting, go ahead and say, okay, I'm open to suggestions. What are we going to do this time around?
Mm-hmm.
Here are some ideas that I think we absolutely need to look at. What else? And then all that leader does, all that moderator does is make sure that each topic is aligned with what's more important to less important,
Mm-hmm.
at least
Mm-hmm.
they see it, or maybe a consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that is on where, how the leader should be.
Yeah. Probably a little bit of everything there. A lot of meetings, at least in my world, are focused on what we did last time. And so very often I'll take last meeting's agenda and just change the date at the top because a lot of the things that we talked about are still going to be relevant this time. Then I eliminate the things that we completed and I'll add new things to the agenda as they come up. Sometimes it's seasonal. That dictates what's going to be on the agenda. Hey, it's Christmas season. Who's going to set up the wreaths? Okay, so that goes on the agenda, right? But that's only seasonal. And then sometimes there is a person in the committee whose real gift is ideas. The moderator does not necessarily have to be the genius who comes up with every good new idea. Very often that's a person in the committee that comes up with ideation. That's kind of what they do well. And your creative types are not necessarily your most organized types either. So the most creative people aren't necessarily the best leaders and moderators for meetings, because their ability to create ideas ends up unintentionally being the new tangent guy, because you take this idea all over the place and then before you know it, we haven't really talked about anything that we actually needed to talk about. So when I'm setting agendas, a lot of it is history, a lot of it is what comes up seasonally or regularly, and then a lot of meetings too, and I'm thinking of session, of course, is committee driven, because the session is a committee of the committees in some sense, and so we're hearing reports from various of the committees, and that ends up being a lot of our agenda anyways. But all committees work differently. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Bill.
So this is all real near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
Like that, but and I thought that this was really good. Just a couple other things I'd share is that when you talk about the purpose of the meeting, it's kind of like it, but the same way you also want to talk about the outcomes that you expect as the leader to get to
Mm-hmm.
out of the meeting, which is kind of the same thing as the purpose, but something
Yeah.
a little bit different. And the other thing too is I found that it's good to kind of talk about what you need from other people in the like up front, to say what you need from other people in the meeting.
Yeah.
As a way to kind of draw out stuff.
Right.
That helps to get feedback from silent people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or other things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. You do a lot of meetings at work, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Every day?
There's a couple meetings every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I lead workshops, kind of like workshops at work too, to try to facilitate ideas
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit familiar to me.
I'm going to put it down in my mind that you should lead this section next time we do the leadership course. I think you'd be good at that. Yeah. Anyone ever do stand-up meetings? You know what stand-up meetings are? It's a meeting that's supposed to be short, so everybody has to stand because you'll be physically exhausted if you don't, and so that forces people to keep on track. If you work at a company where you have a meeting every day, sometimes they'll do a stand-up meeting. Do you guys do stand-up meetings?
Some people do. They're like 5 minutes.
Yeah. Did you do that, Nikki, in your place of employ? No. Keeps it short. Okay, well that's all I've got for you. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So in most cases, meetings we're discussing refer to like committees, teams, so it's the same group of people meeting every time. So as you begin to identify your big opinion or your tangent, like how
Mm-hmm.
many meetings do you let go before you try to talk to that person individually on the side?
Yeah.
It's not every time you're having to, call, kind of bring them in.
Yeah.
Or you're not seeing the eye rolls of everybody else.
Yeah.
Like, oh, here we go
Yeah.
again. Like,
Yeah.
when is it appropriate to say, okay, let's talk?
Yeah. That's a great question. You really have to kind of feel that one as you go. I'm not confrontational myself, so the idea of taking someone aside after a meeting, I would dread that because I always just hope things get better. You know what I mean? But once a meeting has been really ruined by one of those personality types, that's probably the time to have that kind of a talk with somebody, and you just have to grit your teeth and bear it. You just have to do it. I'm in a situation right now, I won't give too many details about it, but in a Bible study group where we have a person that is hard to keep on track. And the part of me that leans towards grace and forgiveness, I just keep thinking, well, next time he'll probably do a little bit better. But I'm to the point now where it's like, nope, I think I got to talk to this person afterwards and say, hey, it's either we're in this to do the Bible study or not. You know what I mean? That's hard. Tough conversations to have. Yeah, Ray and then Bill.
I think there's a way to do that. If you present something positive to start out with the individual, hey, I appreciate you always, wanting to express things, but, and then address the issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The old compliment sandwich. Bill.
I would say, at least in settings that I'm used to, people, like, if you're observing that, other people are observing that too.
Oh, yeah.
And I would say that even the person that's causing the disruption or whatever, probably to some degree understands that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that I typically, or I've seen people typically handle that situation is just say, this is what I've observed.
Yeah.
Please tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
but
that's good.
This is what I see.
Right.
And then generally you put out the facts like that.
Yeah.
It generally kind of helps to just organically have that conversation.
And then you say, let's meet in the parking lot afterwards, right? That's where, yeah, exactly. All right. Well, hey, let's break it up here, and because I want to give you guys enough time to share a little bit about your projects. Hopefully this doesn't catch you off guard, but one of the assignments for this class was to work on one of the 5 project options. So we will do this very informally and organically. Please don't feel that you have to, be terrified that you're giving a presentation. If you want to do it right from your seat, that is totally fine as well. Again, Bryson wanted you to know that he worked hard on his project, and he did send it in by email, so he wanted to